I've had the honor of standing on this House floor every year to remember what our history is and to tell my personal history relative to this Executive Order 9066. Mr. Speaker, this summer I had the opportunity to take a tour along the beautiful waterfront in Seattle, and part of that tour was remembering the internment as it unfolded in our state. We were pointed, our vision and our eyesight was pointed across the water to Bainbridge Island, where the first families were interned and gathered up on the shore of that dock. It was a test, Mr. Speaker. It was a test of how compliant, how loyal those Japanese Americans would be at that moment. It was also a test of how well and how efficient internment can take place when folks are loyal and compliant. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate our opportunity to return to this floor every year and say words like, never again, never forget. And I have come to this floor before on this day of remembrance with a sense of hope and inspiration from what I see. But today I stand here in personal struggle. This is history is repeating. Just over 50 years ago, Mr. Speaker, Federico Chavez Jurado was picking strawberries in a Japanese-owned farm in California. He fell in love with the farmer's daughter, Cynthia Takasugi, and those two became my parents. Would that story play out today? I don't know. And this is why I stand here in personal struggle on the floor today. I have a t-shirt at home that says, Gaman, not just for Issei anymore. Gaman is a Japanese term, a Buddhist term for enduring the seemingly unbearable with patience and dignity. It's a descriptor for people who persevere, who show patience. I have struggled to live up to that expectation, that value, that virtue that my Japanese American family has taught me in action, in words, and in faith. But I struggle today because the rest of my family is experiencing something very different, a repeated history. I had my daughter in my office this morning and I asked her, what am I supposed to say today? And she asked, what is going to be your call to action? I am a biracial woman of a Chicano father and a Japanese American and Hispanic mother. And my children are multiracial children who know how important this moment in this country is. On behalf of my daughter's call to action for this moment, it is for everyone, every American, to recognize that at this moment, we're acknowledging that 120,000 Japanese Americans were interned, and at this very same moment as I stand here, 70,000 families are also in detention, 74% of which have no criminal history. So I stand here in personal deep struggle, a woman of faith who asks myself, who would Jesus round up? This is a moment where we must rise and take action, not just remember.
Through the years, I've shared with you the history that leads us, our country, and our state to observe February 19th as a day of remembrance. I've talked about its antecedents, and more important, its consequences. I've spoken about my family, my American-born mother, who was a mere child of 9 when she was incarcerated, when she was torn from her home, her school, her friends, her life as she knew it. I've boasted of the exploits of the Nisei servicemen, the American-born Japanese soldiers of the 442nd, the 100th Battalion, the Artillery Engineers Battalion, and the Military Intelligence Service, whose record of loyalty and courage are represented by the enormous number of ribbons that fly from the Nisei vets' colors and earn them the distinction of being the most decorated unit in United States history. Mr. Speaker, I've spoken equally about the equally patriotic resistors. People like the University of Washington student Gordon Hirabayashi, born in Auburn, of a military veteran named Min Yasui, and of a teenage love-struck kid from California named Fred Korematsu, as well as of Mitsue Endo, whose court case actually led to the final dismantlement of the concentration camps in America. And I've pointed, Mr. Speaker, to the activists, the mostly 3rd and 4th generation Sansei and Yonsei, including myself, our friends, and our Japanese-American post-war organizations that championed efforts to acknowledge, to seek an apology, and to provide redress for the violations of the Constitution that were visited upon an entire community because of their race. Mr. Speaker, the previous speaker gave you a very comprehensive history of this period. And I wish in this bicentennial year to talk instead about the Constitution of the United States and our Bill of Rights. And I want to tell you about how the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judicial branch, and the people who hold all power in this country and in this state failed to uphold and protect these most defining and cherished documents of our country, Mr. Speaker, and of our American character. Because of time constraints, Mr. Speaker, I'll only focus on a few. But let me begin with the notion of the rule of law. Not just the rule of law, but equal justice under the law. The good gentleman from the 12th District made a very important point. That fear makes humans, and therefore our human governments, turn away from very thoughtful, deliberated principles that we have not only adopted but have embraced, and instead succumb to our basest emotional reactions in the moment. This is a hallmark feature of the wartime incarceration of Japanese Americans that focused on the central question of what is an American. We heard debate recently, Mr. Speaker, that oftentimes when we talk about what is an American, we default to a very facile argument that it's based on citizenship. And we heard debate about whether being a citizen or being a non-citizen is the correct terminology versus being an alien or a non-alien. I stand here, Mr. Speaker, as the granddaughter of an enemy alien. My grandfather was not born in this country. What's interesting about that, Mr. Speaker, is that in 1903, the United States Supreme Court declared that whether or not you were an immigrant or an alien, if you prefer, or a citizen of the United States, that when you are within the boundaries of these United States, we are all entitled to the rights of equal justice under the law, meaning if I have been accused of doing something, I am entitled to a speedy trial. That's what we mean by equal justice under the law. It's ironic, Mr. Speaker, that that court case decided in 1903 is known as the Japanese immigrant case. Mr. Speaker, I'm also the daughter of a non-alien enemy. What does that mean? It means my mother, who was born in Sacramento, California, as was her mother, was determined to be an enemy because of her ancestry. But you couldn't say that she was a citizen because it would fly in the face of the constitutional rights and the character of our American people. Mr. Speaker, that was not just my mother. There were many children who were born, as you've heard before. 2/3 of those who were incarcerated behind barbed wire were American citizens, many of them children like my mother. Mr. Speaker, the reason that my mother, my non-alien mother, was incarcerated was because the government powers, our elected leaders of the time, invoked the Alien Enemies Act, first enacted in the 18th century, and was used to justify the erection of wartime relocation centers, as they were called euphemistically, across the United States. Make no mistake, it was an action taken under the guise of an emergency to expand executive authority in these United States in order to effect something that I hope you would be afraid of, Mr. Speaker, speaking of fear, and that is the idea of losing civilian control of our government. A civilian government established by our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. The good gentleman from the 16th talked about the failure of political leadership. Not only is the executive branch indicted in this, but we also have to look to the capitulation of Congress, its failure to exercise its separate and independent authority to be a check and a balance to the executive branch, as well as the complete betrayal of the courts. Mr. Speaker, we had military martial law within the boundaries of these United States. Civilian Order Number 1 was that military authority. I do want to finally talk about why we observe the Day of Remembrance. Well, it's very simple, Mr. Speaker. It's for the same reason we observe Independence Day. For the same reason we remember Memorial Day. For the same reason we observe Veterans Day. Because we want to remember our American roots as seekers of liberty, of the notion of res publica for the people, and the importance of self-government in that form of government, of justice, equal justice, and opportunity, and how the things that are worth fighting for are not free. Mr. Speaker, you heard earlier that after a 20-year fight, the Japanese Americans did eventually win redress. And the Congress and the executive, and eventually the courts, all acknowledged their failures. But, Mr. Speaker, I think, as I think about what this day means to us, and I will ask if I can read.
Please proceed.
It's important to remember the words of President Reagan when he signed the bill that formally apologized. And he said, as he was signing the bill, quoting himself actually, "Blood that has soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color. America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on a race, but on a way, an ideal. Not in spite of, but because of our polyglot background, we have had all the strength in the world. That is the American way." And he goes on to say, The name of that young actor, I hope I pronounced this right, was Ronald Reagan. And yes, the ideal of liberty and justice for all, that is still the American way. Mr. Speaker, we observe the Day of Remembrance because, as our Madam Speaker reflected very recently on the news of the passage of the Reverend Jesse Jackson, we've lost the last living link to an icon of the civil rights movement. And I reflect that our obligation, our legacy, is to carry on their work, which, Mr. Speaker, you know is a very Japanese concept. Okage-sama de. Because of all of those who came before me, I am. It's very reminiscent of the quote of the great Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was the mentor to the Reverend Jackson, who noted that I can never be who I am meant to be until you are fully who you are meant to be. Mr. Speaker, okage-sama de.